So, I'm Gary Chartier, and I'm an anarchist. Hi, I'm Gary, and I'm an anarchist. I teach a variety of things at La Sierra University in Riverside, where I'm also the Associate Dean of the Tom and Vi Zapara School of Business, and I do research mainly these days related to law and ethics and politics. I do some other work in other areas of philosophy, but mainly in those.
What is anarchism, and why are you an anarchist?
Well, so anarchism, people mean different things by it. I take anarchism to be the project of doing without the state, the project, that is, of organizing our lives on the basis of peaceful, voluntary cooperation. That certainly has to be understood in light of the fact that the state isn't the only entity that ever engages in violence or gets in the way of peaceful, voluntary cooperation. And so being an anti-statist isn't enough. The mafia obviously could make your life pretty miserable even without the state. But I think that the state is the most serious problem for people who want a peaceful, voluntary society. I'm an anarchist because I like peace, because I like voluntary interaction, because I think people are creative and can come up with solutions that top-down planners can't, because I see states engage in so much mischief on behalf of entrenched ideologies and elites. I feel like giving people the freedom to work out their problems on their own and together in cooperative settings rather than in light of some top-down authority means we'll have better solutions and we'll avoid the problems states create.
So can you tell us how in a stateless society law could exist at all?
Well, so anthropologists will differ about where we want to draw the line in terms of when a society has law and when it doesn't, but it's certainly common, I think, if we read literature and cultural anthropology, to note that societies that don't have what we would call states nonetheless have what we would call laws. The fact is that if you have norms that people endorse and you have mechanisms for enforcing those, for ensuring that when they're violated there are ways of dealing with that, you got law. And I think what's clear is that people without top-down control, for a whole range of reasons, can support and maintain norms, and I think people can also accept, and this is important, kind of second-order norms about enforcement procedures. And when they do that, when there is enough endorsement of enforcement procedures that those are treated as legitimate, because I think part of law, it seems to me, is this recognition that something is legitimate, that it's not just a naked exercise of power, then at that point there can be stable mechanisms for dispute resolution and law enforcement that don't have to be directed by a central authority. They can be, and this is the expression that you get in both economists and in social scientists of other kinds, and anthropologists and so forth, law can be polycentric, that you can have, instead of a single legal authority in a given geographic area, you can have a variety of institutions with overlapping jurisdictions and mandates that in various ways negotiate out their relationships with each other and their relationships with particular people. When that happens, you can have law, systems in which law is maintained even without Leviathan.
Can you tell me why you support markets instead of supporting capitalism?
Yeah, so as we know, words are messy and complicated, and philosophers like to pretend that it's easy to tidily define words, but I think we know from both empirical work in language and from philosophy of language it's just not the case. And so there are people who use the word capitalism and mean something quite benign by it, but lots of other people do not, and our goal is to try to avoid endorsement of the non-benign things that people mean. So sometimes people will just mean, in talking about capitalism, private property and markets. Well, okay, that's fine. But sometimes we find people instead meaning things like all existing property titles are fine, or the people in charge of the economic system are there because they're, this is really what a free market would produce, when in fact the existing market arrangements we have are riddled with politically secured privilege. And so we want to emphasize that we want to use William Gillis's great phrase, freed markets, that is liberated markets, markets that are liberated from the privileges that distort what's going on in current market processes in all kinds of ways. And the past injustices are remedied, ongoing privileges are eliminated. And so by distinguishing what we're talking about from, quote, capitalism, instead we want freed markets, first of all, I think we have a great kind of rhetorical and pedagogical opportunity to emphasize that we're not endorsing the status quo. And we think it's quite important to stress that, because so much opposition to markets comes, I think, from the fear that bad things people see around them today are predictable outcomes of market interactions, when they fail to take into account the degree to which the markets that are producing those interactions are distorted in various ways.
What role does academia play in furthering anarchism's cause?
Okay, so it seems to me that we have to be very much aware of the degree to which research funding by the state shapes what goes on in many, many institutions. Funding by the state in general shapes what goes on in many institutions, because of course there's a whole host of regulations that comes along with accepting that state money. But in addition to that, we know that there are captive markets for the products of higher educational institutions created by licensing requirements and accreditation requirements that depend on the possession of licenses that in turn can come only with accredited educational backgrounds and so forth. So I think that there are certainly reasons to regard the existing higher education market with some suspicion. At the same time, I think we might also want to recognize that long before there were the same sorts of licensing requirements and accrediting requirements, and long before there was government research money and so forth, there were higher educational institutions going back, 1,500 or more years. And I think what that reflects is a kind of twofold benefit that those institutions were perceived to offer. First of all, that learning happens very often in conversation. It happens with groups of people coming together, and also that there's some value in institutions that encourage people to think and write about important issues and ideas. Societies like, in one way or another, I think most people in societies on one level or another, if they don't pay too much for it, would like there to be folks thinking about a variety of issues in science and history and philosophy and so forth, and universities provide the opportunity for that to happen. Now, we recognize that one key difference between what was true 1,500 years ago and now is that physical institutions are less important. I still think that face-to-face interactions matter for things that we want to accomplish, but I am sure we're going to see higher education changed dramatically by the increasing ability to have distributed educational models that don't depend on physical campuses. I'm enough of a dinosaur that, I'm almost 50, I'll be 50 in a couple of months, and who I am has been shaped for, my entire adult life by engagement with higher education. And I expect that if I were young enough that I'd have to kind of live through those changes over a longer period than I probably will, I'm sure I would find that disruptive. But I get that it's very important to open up the possibilities that are created by making a broader range of educational opportunities available with technology and so forth. But I do really think, I guess I'll just say at the same time, that institutions in general that do both provide kind of immersion in particular intellectual traditions and also serve to create and extend those traditions, that can be helpful. With regard to anarchism, then, there clearly are people who use the freedom provided by the opportunity to study and teach in educational settings to come up with and share radical ideas. One of the interesting things about C4SS, the Center for a Stateless Society, of which I'm a senior fellow, is the way in which it's a mix of such people. There are people like me and Roderick Long who have quite conventional academic births, and then there are other people like William Gillis or Charles Johnson or Sheldon Richman, who really have not been part of those academic environments. Somebody like Kevin Carson, perhaps a kind of extreme example, where some of the rest of us at least are paid to write, like Sheldon, or to edit. Kevin works as a hospital orderly and writes huge academic books on the side. So I think there's a range of possibilities. But I do think that the institutions, despite the obvious flaws that I'm happy to admit they have still created some space in which anarchist thinking and activism has occurred. We're here at the University of Oklahoma, where there's a really active Students for a Stateless Society chapter that's been involved in, I think, radicalizing local libertarians and challenging anarchists from other backgrounds and so forth. Probably it would have been harder to make that happen without this institutional setting. So I haven't given up on the university, even as at the same time I recognize that it's got big changes coming.
To what extent should libertarians concern themselves with non-state oppression such as racism and sexism?
Yeah, so there's a lot to say about this, and I'd want to say it under a couple of different heads. So you might think about an instrumental concern and about an intrinsic concern. So instrumentally, you might think there are reasons to be worried about these things insofar as they are in one way or another detrimental to the cause of achieving liberty. So if you think, for instance, that, I don't know, let's just take an extreme example. Let's say you're in 1929 Germany. If somebody had been able to really change the cultural dynamic so that fear and hatred of Jews wasn't there to the same degree, would have made it much harder for a dictatorial regime to come to power over the next few years that rooted its activities in obviously hostility to the French, but also in rampant, blatant anti-Semitism. So you might think there are connections between different kinds of bad behavior on the part of state actors, and in one way or another, they can use those concerns with various kinds of non-state misbehavior the non-state misbehavior can feed bad state behavior. So that's, I guess, the kind of thing I'm thinking about in connection with the Nazis. So you can think about a number of instrumental, I think, probably concerns of that kind. You might think that part of the process of raising consciousness for people is alerting them to one kind of problem, and if you only doing that maybe provides a way into talking about other things. But those are all instrumental, and I don't think those are unreasonable ways to think about the connection between libertarianism and these kinds of non-state activities. But also, I think there are more intrinsic concerns, and I'll just talk about two of those. One, I think, the underlying kind of moral vision seems to me that to which libertarianism is responsive is an idea that we can talk about in different ways, but that certainly seems to involve the idea that people have equal rights and equal authority. And by equal authority, I mean the kind of, it's another way, I think, of putting the point that people are fundamentally self-owners, that you get to decide, who you are, what's going to happen to your life, that someone else doesn't have the entitlement to decide, and under ordinary circumstances at any rate, for you. And so whether you think about that in terms of equal rights or equal authority or something else, if you think about what would make sense of that claim, it seems like the idea has to be that there's a kind of fundamental sort of moral and political equality. And that doesn't mean that everybody's character is equally good or everybody's achievements are equally good. People obviously aren't equal in those ways, but that there's a kind of moral core of personhood that merits respect that's equal. And if you think that's the case, then it seems to me it's going to be a natural outgrowth of that kind of moral attitude to look at people on the basis of ethnicity or gender or sexual identity, whatever, and say whatever those differences are, there's still something fundamentally here that's equal, in virtue of which it makes sense to treat people in a fair and considerate way that doesn't depend on these other factors. You might think about this also as an expression of a kind of deep ideal of individualism. So you think about Ayn Rand's observation that racism is the worst form of collectivism, that if you're an individualist, yes, you can be a narrowly political individualist and not think about the broader social consequences, but if you think about individualism as an attitude rooted in this fundamental sense of people as, certainly very different in lots of ways, but at some deep level, equal in status, then I think that's going to prompt you to be concerned about the kind of collectivist erasure of those differences and oppression of people. And obviously that doesn't mean you handle that in the same way you handle it with state oppression. It's not something that's an instance of the misuse of force, and so you obviously need to be careful and nonviolent and respectful in the ways you deal with these things, but I think they ought to be matters of concern because of this fundamental point about equality. The other thing I'd say in that connection is there's a kind of libertarian ideal, which is an ideal of freedom, of non-domination, of, to use a technical expression, not being pushed around. And I think that many times people are drawn to libertarianism precisely because they don't want to be pushed around and don't want to see other people pushed around. And I think it's not unnatural at all for people who have that attitude to see analogies between nonviolent mistreatment and violent mistreatment. And even if they recognize that there's something special about violence insofar as force is the only thing we can reasonably respond to with force, nonetheless, they might see important analogies of various kinds that might really trouble them and that they might respond to. And I guess that's the way I experience things.
So what advice would you have for anarchists looking to make anarchy come to fruition? This is a question about tactics and strategy. How do we get from here to there?
So I think it's a really hard question, because I think there is the two things. There's kind of institutional momentum in favor of maintaining states, and I think there's a kind of ideological momentum. People just assume that the current state of affairs is natural. We've had something like the modern state system for the last 500 years, and it's just kind of embedded in the way people think about stuff. And of course, there were certainly governments, even if there weren't states before that. People listen to stories of the Middle Ages, and they don't recognize that the Middle Ages were marked by the presence of polycentric law. They just think, wow, there were kings and stuff. And so, yeah, we have democracies now, but it's, states are there. So there's this institutional ideological momentum, and I think you have to challenge that. I'm skeptical. I start out by saying I'm skeptical that you challenge it with electoral politics. I think there are people who really believe that's helpful. I don't think they're evil. I don't buy the view that somehow if you're involved in electoral politics, you therefore treat everything the state does as legitimate, or even everything a candidate you might like does as legitimate. I don't think that's right. You might be very defensive in your strategy. You're just trying to avoid causing certain problems and moving beyond certain kinds of bad things that states do. So it's not that kind of bright line ideological purist objection, but I just think the reality is it's very ineffective. And not only is it ineffective, but it tends to divert people's energies into this ineffective activity. And I'm not just talking about the people who get involved in campaigns. I mean, and this is the most troubling thing, the people who sit in their living rooms and find that they can't help but cheering for a team in one way or another. And the birth of that team spirit, I think, frankly, kills people's capacity to think critically, and often serves to kind of dull and deaden their faculties and lead them to just dive into a kind of endorsement of the current political system that really, I think, is most unfortunate. So my approach wouldn't therefore focus on that. Maybe in a particular case somebody could make a strategic case for that, fine, but it's not a general strategy I'd favor. I think that in broad terms, I would say there's ongoing need for kind of breaking the stranglehold of that ideology that supports the state. So I think communicating at multiple levels, all the way from theoretical tracts to just random conversations on the subway. So I wouldn't say electoral politics was the main thing. Like I said, it seems to me there's some real advantage to thinking about kind of personal relationships that really give you a chance to put your values on display. Because I think a lot of people are scared of anarchists and cynical about libertarians, and I think it's nice to really show what we're really made of. But I actually think the two strategies that are likely to be most effective aren't easy, but I think none of this is likely to be altogether easy. So, they're not what I do, right? My work is very much at this level of kind of ideological delegitimation and, coming around and preaching to the choir in places like this. But I think two things that matter. First of all, putting on alternatives on display, I think, is hugely important. It seems to me that being able to show what communities look like when they are not organized on the basis of top-down control and aggression, that's hugely important. And so that I think the ventures that started in the 70s, trying to create, quote, libertarian countries, I think often were just kind of silly exercises and people were hunting for tax shelters and so forth. But the underlying idea seems to me really right, that what we know, if we know anything about social change, is that the scariest thing for the status quo is seeing that there are viable alternatives. Not hearing it asserted that there are viable alternatives, but seeing that there are viable alternatives. Because if people can look at an alternative and say, even if it's not perfect, there's something very attractive about some features of that I'd like to see replicated, that's, I think, how ideas spread. And so, the Seasteading Institute's work, the work of people trying to create, free cities in Central America and so forth. I mean, none of those ideas is perfect, but I think there's something really useful about that as a way of exploding the consciousness of the public by showing that it's not really the case that kind of the state-driven status quo is the only possibility. The other thing, and I think one needs to be really careful in talking about this. Definitely not urging anyone within the sound of my voice to get in trouble with the authorities. Please, please think responsibly. But the other thing that really strikes me is likely to be most effective in leading to change, the most effective thing we can do, is through those efforts that try to tunnel around and under the state. So the creation of alternate mechanisms for for various kinds of things. Clearly, the cryptocurrency movement is an obvious example of this, but other kinds of efforts, increasingly widespread use of encryption technology opens up a variety of opportunities for people to transact outside the state's purview. The more you can make the state irrelevant to people's lives and the more you can shed its control in your day-to-day existence, the less significant it becomes. And so, it's like, what if they gave a state and nobody came? At some point, that's, I think, going to matter a great deal. So, as David Friedman has suggested, there's a kind of ongoing competition between those seeking privacy and those seeking to interfere with privacy. And there's an ongoing back and forth as the technology develops, and it's not going to stop. So I think that's also significant. Then the attempt in various ways to create alternatives, not so much for purposes of display, but for purposes of evasion, okay, and rendering irrelevant. You think about the ways in which, say a group like Food Not Bombs, very non-violently might, try to simply displace what a state does in the social services arena. So the other thing I would say, and it's not something we can do, but it's something the state can do to itself. States overreach, and certainly I think if so the American empire, it seems to me, if it's not careful, is clearly going to bankrupt itself. The attempt to operate an empire of bases, 700 to 900 bases around the world, to maintain, 7 wars at the same time, to do all of the interventions in the economy that are sought at the macro level as part of a, misguided effort to achieve macro stabilization. All of those things, it seems to me, are going to put increasing pressure on, on states. And we might also expect that one driver of change will be the realization that this dramatic growth in the size and scope of state power that we've seen over the past, say 150 years, really is not going to prove ultimately sustainable. So, but that's not something we can do directly. It's just something probably we can watch. Yeah, so lots of great things out there that reflect broader anarchist and libertarian concerns of various kinds. My own self-promotional speech here is go check out the work of the Center for Stateless Society at c4ss.org. Check out the book, Markets Not Capitalism, which you referred to earlier by using its title. And the simple way to find that is probably just to Google Markets Not Capitalism PDF, and you will find at least one online version of the almost final version of that very helpful collection of historical and contemporary essays on market anarchism, rooted in the kind of the 19th century individualist anarchists and their successors. My own stuff, of course, I'm happy to promote. My academic book on this topic is called Anarchy and Legal Order. It's long and still, unfortunately, fairly expensive. Fortunately, there is a paperback out now. At a more popular level, I've also written a book called The Conscience of an Anarchist that I think is a short, crisp, and readable introduction to the kind of anarchism I would promote. So, c4ss.org, Markets Not Capitalism, The Conscience of an Anarchist. Those would probably be the things I would immediately refer people to. There are lots of others, but I think those are portals. So the Conscience of an Anarchist has a long annotated bibliography full of many other things people might look at. C4SS points people to lots of other things. Oh, and there's also the Alliance of the Libertarian Left online, lots and lots of links that we provide there as well. So those are some places people might want to start.